So my topic today is wanting and longing. Most of all, I loved to read, and I was a disgustingly erudite child. But I should never have thought of making use of what I knew. I was a monad searching for a destiny that didn't exist. What I had at that time, and it has never left me, was a dream of a reality that we could only touch tangentially, an awe of the numinous in nature whose power rested in its very unattainability. It was a feeling for the necessity of darkness in the life of man. In the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo depicts the creation of man, God's finger and that of Adam are separated by a short space. That distance I called eternity, and there I felt I was sent to travel. The words are not mine. Nor are they those of a romantic poet, but those of an Austro-Hungarian professor of biochemistry at Columbia, Erwin Chargaff, whose researches, which he freely shared with Crick and Watson, led to what are known as Chargaff's rules and paved the way for the discovery of the structure of DNA. There is a myth put about by science that it progresses by an impulsion of events according to the scientific method, in which one certainty after another is secured, each logically leading to the next in ordered succession. There are many reasons to doubt this account, most of which will be familiar enough, starting with the impossibility of securing certainty through science or any other means, the limiting assumptions that are built into its models, the way ideas leap ahead of results, the role of chance and serendipity in scientific investigation, and so on. But what I want to draw attention to today is that true science is essentially an exercise of imagination. Here are two of the greatest scientists of the last 50 years speaking. One, a biologist, Sir Peter Medawar. Scientists should not be ashamed to admit, as many of them apparently are ashamed to admit, that hypotheses appear in their minds along uncharted byways of thought, that they're imaginative and inspirational in character, that they are indeed adventures of the mind. And the other, a physicist, Richard Feynman. Our imagination is stretched to the utmost, not as in fiction, to imagine things which are not really there, but just to comprehend those things which are there. A professor of mathematics, Alice Sfard, has studied the ways in which scientists and mathematicians reach their findings. From interviewing them at length, she concluded that it was quite clear that for them, one of the best indications of understanding is the ability to sense that something is true in an immediate manner without having recourse to a formal proof. Having a result without knowing how it was obtained is perhaps the most striking phenomenon in the work of a mathematician. Those are her words. That results precede arguments was a commonplace of ancient mathematicians. In that same spirit, Carl Friedrich Gauss, one of the most fertile mathematical minds of all time, remarked, "I've had my results for a long time, but I don't know yet how I'm to arrive at them." To pick two famous mathematicians out of many, Johan Euler, who was also an astronomer and incidentally the discoverer of the, to me, most beautiful findings in the whole of mathematics, that e to the I pi equals -1, stated that arithmetical theorems are, quote, discovered long before their truth has been confirmed by rigid demonstration. And George Polya, that you have to guess a mathematical theorem before you prove it. More broadly, beauty is a test of correctness that many mathematicians and scientists have experienced as a touchstone in their work. And not just as an incidental observation either. G.H. Hardy, in his A Mathematician's Apology, wrote, "Beauty is the first test. There is no permanent place in the world for ugly mathematics." Similarly, Henri Poincaré wrote that the feeling of mathematical beauty, of the harmony of numbers and forms, of geometric elegance, is a true aesthetic feeling that all real mathematicians know. Einstein said that the theory of relativity occurred to me by intuition, and music is the driving force behind this intuition. Those are his exact words. According to Bertrand Russell, mathematics, rightly viewed, possesses not only truth, but supreme beauty. Incidentally, for what it's worth, Semir Zeki and colleagues found that mathematical beauty activates the same parts of the brain as other kinds of beauty, so it seems likely that this experience is comparable with more widespread kinds of aesthetic appreciation. It goes further. Paul Dirac even pronounced in relation to the discovery by Schrödinger of the wave equation, it is more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. This is because, initially, Schrödinger's equation did not fit the data, given the state of knowledge at the time, and he lost heart. But once electron spin was discovered, his equation fitted the data perfectly. Schrödinger, according to Dirac, got this, quote, very beautiful equation by pure thought, looking for some beautiful generalization of de Broglie's ideas. It seems that if one is working from the point of view of getting beauty in one's equations, and if one has really a sound insight, one is on a sure line of progress. The great mathematician and physicist Hermann Weyl had a similar experience. My work, Weyl said, always tried to unite the true and the beautiful, but when I had to choose one or the other, I usually chose the beautiful. Although initially some of his work in physics was rejected on the basis that it seemed to conflict with the experimental results then available, the subsequent formulation of quantum mechanics led to an acceptance of the important truth of Weyl's work. Thus, as in the case of Schrödinger, before the full scientific facts were known, the sheer beauty of Weyl's work anticipated its truth. Now, you may well be wondering what all this has to do with today's topic. I mention it because it underscores an aspect of real scientific understanding which is not often enough stressed. Science involves a vision, in a sense almost akin to that one might use of religion, a sense of feeling one's way towards something that is beautiful and true, and at first only dimly perceived, and which may be unjustifiable according to the tenets of the time. Yet it calls one onward. The scientist or mathematician intuits a form and is drawn forward towards it, not pushed blindly forward, mechanically, by a series of steps, as it were, from behind. And the truth, even mathematical and scientific truth, is intrinsically beautiful. The process is one of attraction towards something that is deeply alluring, transcendent, and only partly known. Can such a process be called longing? Perhaps not, without some violence to the ordinary sense of the word. But it's much closer than merely wanting or willing a solution to a problem. Essentially, it is a creative act of perception, not an act of possession. However, the process is aimed at a goal that is potentially capable of being fulfilled here and now. That is the hope. Finally, the equations get to be solved. That longing, by contrast, tends to be of an unfulfillable nature is not experienced as a failing, as it would be in the satisfaction of an appetite, but a guarantee of its special worth. And even Chargaff the scientist speaks of an awe of the numinous in nature whose power rested in its very unattainability. It is that indefinite prolongation of the process of becoming without finally collapsing into being that is of principal value. In Wordsworth's wonderful phrase, something evermore about to be. It is that that creates new knowledge, new understanding, new life. All else is finished, lifeless. More prosaically, A.N. Whitehead saw all great art as providing for the soul vivid but transient values, so that something new must be discovered, the permanent realization of values extending beyond its former self. Wanting wants to close down on the target that it knows. Longing longs to remain in a state of fruitful unknowing. And here again, I think of words of Chargaff, who, despite my remarks about the aim of science being to fulfill its aim by closing on its target, felt something beyond. It would seem to me, says Chargaff, that man cannot live without mysteries. One would say the great biologists work in the very light of darkness. We have been deprived of this fertile night. Somebody who had read these words said to me, Chargaff continues, you seem to appreciate the natural sciences only as long as they're not successful. Darkness illuminated becomes light. I could only answer, what is success in science? Illuminated darkness is not light. We find ourselves in the cavern of limitless possibilities. Take a flashlight with you, and you may find you're only in a lumber room. If I know what I shall find, I do not want to find it. Uncertainty is the salt of life. And he said, when you say darkness, you mean obscurity. This I denied, but I do not think we achieve conciliation. Chargaff senses that, as Wittgenstein noted, there are kinds of unknowing that are wiser than certain kinds of knowing. Or as Thomas Nagel puts it, certain forms of perplexity, for example, about freedom, knowledge, and the meaning of life, seem to me to embody more insight than any of the supposed solutions to those problems. According to the philosopher James Cass, there are at least two kinds of games. One could be called finite, the other infinite. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing the play. What I suggest is that while philosophy and theology know they are playing infinite games, science often does not. At least some of its practitioners seem at times to think it's playing a finite one, or at least a non-infinite series of finite ones. But that is not the case. When Whitehead spoke of transient values, he was in no sense disparaging the status of what it is that art brings us to see. Instead, he was drawing attention to the way we do not just see things, but see through them, their semi-transparent nature revealing what lies beyond, which becomes the true object of our longing. The eye must not rest on the appearances of nature itself, or on the surface qualities of the work of art, but see through them to something sublime beyond. In George Herbert's famous words, a man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleases through it pass, and then the heavens espy. In other words, Whitehead was referring to the never-completed process whereby we are led out beyond ourselves, with no goal of a self-interested nature in view, towards something which turns out to be, at least as far as mortal understanding goes, an unending quest. But that quest is for something intuited that inspires in us a longing for its beauty. The uncertain, almost purposeless, open-ended nature of this process in relation to the human soul is perhaps best captured by Richard Hooker in a well-known passage from the first book of his Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. For man does not seem to rest satisfied either with fruition of that wherewith his life is preserved, or with performance of such actions as advance him most deservedly in estimation, but doth further covet, yea, oftentimes manifestly pursue with great sedulity and earnestness that which cannot stand him in any stead for vital use, that which exceedeth the reach of sense, yea, somewhat above capacity of reason, somewhat divine and heavenly, which with hidden exaltation it rather surmiseth than conceiveth. Somewhat it seeketh, and what that is directly it knoweth not, yet very intentive desire thereof doth so incite it, that all other known delights and pleasures are laid aside. They give place to the search of this but only suspected desire. Before I have more to say about wanting and longing, a necessary digression. To the extent that people are interested in what I have to say at all, it's mainly because of my work on brain lateralization, and I can't postpone saying something about that because it's relevant to what follows. In a book called The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, I put forward a thesis about the controversial question of the origins and survival value of a divided and asymmetrical brain. Here I can give only the briefest possible outline of the thesis. Evidence and argument in favour of the thesis itself are presented at length in The Master and His Emissary and explicitly lie outside the scope of this paper. Many of the findings of neuroscience offer us no more than a description of the brain correlates of human experience. As such, they offer a description of experience at a reduced level, but do not directly illuminate the nature of that experience. This often leads to what I and others refer to as neurobollocks. Indeed, it is argued by some philosophers that the brain cannot tell us anything about experience that we could not have discovered by introspection, since by definition the inwardness of mental life has to be the authority on experience. Deeply sympathetic as I am to this point of view, the thesis of the Master and His Emissary is, I believe, different in this regard. It suggests that knowledge about reliable differences between the cerebral hemispheres can tell us something of considerable importance about our mental world, which would not easily be discoverable by introspection, since for reasons of survival, nature has taken care to hide it from us. Awareness of it would bring life to a standstill. The argument can be very briefly stated. In Darwinian terms, there is a need to be able to feed and to keep a lookout for predators at one and the same time. This requires the bringing to bear of diametrically opposed types of attention to the world simultaneously. One, narrow beam, sharply focused, fragmentary, already committed to its object. The other, broad, open, sustained, vigilant, and uncommitted as to what it might find. This is a difficult feat. The solution adopted by all mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds, and even fish so far studied is a divided brain, in which the two halves remain sufficiently distinct to function independently, but sufficiently connected to function in concert. This is also, unsurprisingly, the case in humans, where the evidence is that the left hemisphere tends to yield the first type of attention and the right hemisphere the second. Since the nature of attention, the way in which we attend, governs the nature of the world that comes to attention, and since each hemisphere on its own is capable of yielding a coherent experiential world, two radically different types of attention should lead to two radically different experiential worlds, with different qualities, goals, and values. Evidence from a wealth of sources, including brain insults, traumatic injury, stroke, tumor, and so on, neuropsychological experiments in normal and post-commissurotomy subjects, and brain monitoring in a range of modalities suggest that this is indeed the case. In one world, the left hemisphere version, as in a map, things are simplified. Here there are familiar, reliable, clear, certain, static, isolated, fragmentary elements that can be easily manipulated, are decontextualized, abstracted, detached, disembodied, mechanical, relatively uncomplicated by issues of beauty and morality, except in a consequentialist sense, and relatively untroubled by the complexity of empathy, emotion, and human significance. They are put together as brick on brick to build a wall, so as to reach conclusions that are taken to be unimpeachable. There is an excess of confidence and a lack of insight. This world is useful for purposes of manipulation, but is not a helpful guide to understanding the nature of the underlying reality. Its use is local and for the short term. In the other world, the right hemisphere version, which is truer to the world revealed to us by physics, by poetry, and simply by the business of living, things are almost infinitely more complex. Nothing is clearly the same as anything else. All is tentative, uncertain, provisional, and complexly interconnected with everything else. Nothing is ever static, detached from our awareness of it, or disembodied, and everything needs to be understood in context, where, if it's not to be denatured, it must remain implicit. Here, wholes are more than the sum of the parts, and beauty and morality, along with empathy and emotional depth, help us to intuit meaning that lies beyond the banality of the familiar and everyday. The overall timbre is sober and tentative. The world is truer to what is, but is harder to comprehend and to express in language, and less useful for practical purposes that are local and short-term. On the other hand, for a broader or longer-term understanding, it is essential. In reality, we are a composite of the two hemispheres, and despite the interesting results of experiments designed artificially to separate their functioning, they work together most of the time at the everyday level. But that does not at all exclude that they may have radically different agendas, and over long time periods and large numbers of individuals, it becomes apparent that they each instantiate a way of being in the world that is at conflict with the other. Every attempt to reflect on life, understand the world, or convey its true nature in language, in other words, every project of philosophy or theology, is an attempt to reconcile fundamentally incompatible models of the world, each of which can claim to reveal aspects of reality. These attempts can, I suggest, be illuminated by an awareness of the conflicting models of the world yielded by the two hemispheres of our brains. One interesting difference has to do with the form or structure of the world each hemisphere conceives. As the left hemisphere construes the world, it is composed of pieces which need to be put together, connected by forming linear chains. This is not the living world as it presences, to use a Heideggerian locution, but a schematic representation in two-dimensional form. Literally, the perception of depth in space and time is poor or absent in the left hemisphere. In this world, we are atomistic entities pursuing our own utilitarian ends, yet at the same time pushed forwards by concatenations of events and circumstances. As the right hemisphere construes the world, things are fundamentally interconnected, and so do not form linear chains, but a seamless flow. Here, influence is no longer unidirectional, but mutual or reverberative, conceived as three-dimensional, creating a sphere, as we say, of influence. Metaphorically speaking, it's more like the action of gravity and the other three fundamental forces recognized by contemporary physics. Copernicus thought of gravity as a, quote, natural inclination to combine the parts in the form of a sphere and thus contribute to the unity and wholeness. What Arthur Koestler refers to rather nicely, I think, as the nostalgia of things to become spheres. We are inextricably entangled with everything else that exists, so that nothing has meaning just on its own, and we make choices as much because of what beckons from afar off in front of us as because of what propels us immediately from behind. This, incidentally, as you will readily see, has implications for the balance between determinism and free will, a topic which I mustn't digress to now. One could make an argument that Freud's theories of the psyche are, at least in this respect, of a left hemisphere nature, 19th century hydraulic systems in which we are propelled by drives and where we survive, if we do, by letting off steam when pressure builds past a certain point. The theories of Jung, being of a more right hemisphere kind, are, by contrast, to employ a similar metaphor, electromagnetic in nature, positing something like force fields whereby strange attractors influence the shaping and direction of the psyche. Jung's archetypes are in this sense of particular interest, deep-lying forms that we do not so much cognize as recognize, and in the presence of which we are wrapped. We experience them, whether erotic or otherwise, as what one might call finitæ moi moments, being in the presence of the divine. And when absent from our lives, archetypes become the objects of our longing. When present, there is a sense of coming home. The left hemisphere's disposition towards the world is one of fulfilling needs by using the world from which it is relatively detached. The right hemisphere's disposition is one of care, Sorge, a commitment to the world in order to understand it. Wanting is a drive, such as the left hemisphere experiences or possibly embodies, in which one is impelled, as it were, from behind towards something which is inert and from which one is isolated, something not participating in the process except through the fact of its existence. In longing, by contrast, one is drawn from in front towards something from which one is already not wholly separate, and which exerts an influence through that division within union. The first is unidirectional, the second bidirectional. There is a betweenness. The first is linear, the second, as the concept of a field suggests, holistic, round in shape. The first has a clear view of its target. The second intuits its other, which is in principle never fully known. The first is a simple in the sense of unmixed process. One either wants or does not want. Longing, by contrast, is full of mixed emotions, a point I will return to. Let's look more directly now at the difference between wanting and longing. And where better to begin than with the words themselves? Want comes from the same Old Norse root as wane and means a lack, a deficiency that needs to be filled up. Satisfaction of an appetite. In Anglo-Saxon, as in Old Saxon, Old High German and Old Norse, from which it derives, the roots of the verb to long relate to the word meaning to seem or be or grow long, hence to reach out or extend towards. The word langian in Anglo-Saxon, like its equivalents in each of the other languages, is impersonal in grammatical form, with an accusative of the person who is longing. Thus, not I long for, but literally, it longs me of, whatever it might be. This form, at least to me, suggests something about longing that differentiates it from wanting, or merely desiring a thing. Wanting is clear, purposive, urgent, driven by the will, always with its goal clearly in view. Longing, by contrast, is something that happens between us and another thing. It's not directed by will, and is not an aim with the ultimate goal of acquisition, but is instead a desire for union, or rather it is experienced as a desire for reunion. This goes with there not necessarily being an explicit notion of what it is that is longed for, which remains in the realms of the implicit or intuitive, and is often spiritual in nature. Spiritual longing and melancholy share these more diffuse and reverberative features of something that happens or comes about between ourselves and another, whatever it may be. In either case, it's not necessarily possible to say what the cause, or better the origin, is, what the melancholy or the longing is about or for. Wanting is clear in its target and in its separation from the thing that is wanted. Longing suggests instead a distance, but a never-interrupted connection or union over that distance with whatever it is that is longed for, however remote the object of longing may be. It is somehow experienced as an elastic tension that is set up between the one that is longing and the object of that longing, the pull or tautness as in a bowstring, holding together the two ends of the bow that are never really separate. In German, the word for a bowstring is Bogensehne, and the feeling of longing for something that exists outside the self, to which it feels itself to be connected, is famously crystallized in the word Sehnsucht, from das Sehnen, meaning longing. Das Sehnen is from the same root as die Sehne, a tendon. The object of longing is that towards which we tend, and tendon is similarly related to the words tend and tendency. In fact, the English word sinew is cognate with die Sehne, and sinew used to refer to the whole elastic union of muscle and tendon. These images suggest the workings of a joint, such as, for example, the elbow. The joint is made possible by the existence of the tendon, an elastic connection that allows the bones that take part in the joint, but do not constitute the joint, to move away from one another and to remain connected, or to move together and remain separate. An image picked up wittily but nonetheless profoundly by Donne in his pair of compasses, the image of the two lovers in A Valediction forbidding mourning. What this concept seems to me to enshrine is the feeling of being connected to something but removed from it. The connection remains despite the distance and the separation despite the sense of union. The distinction exists within the union which trumps it. However distinguished, the individual remains part of the whole and is understandable only in terms of the whole of which it forms a part. I've already suggested that the idea of longing, often thought of as a primarily poetic thing in nature, can be found mutatis mutandis in all areas where the human heart and mind are engaged fully with the world. So I started with maths and physics. I cannot prove it, but it seems to me obvious that much music expresses a sense of longing better than any other of the arts. It has been said that music, like poetry, is intrinsically sad, and a survey of music from many parts of the world would bear that out. Not, of course, that there is no joyful music, but that even such music often appears to be joy torn from the teeth of sadness, a sort of holiday of the minor key. It's what we would expect in view of the emotional timbre of the right hemisphere, which is melancholy. And there is a stronger affinity between the right hemisphere and the minor key, as well as between the left hemisphere, which is optimistic, and unreasonably so, by the way, and the major key. The pre-Socratic philosopher Gorgias wrote that awe, phrike, and tearful pity and mournful desire enter those who listen to poetry. And at this time, poetry and song were one. The often bittersweet nature of music draws attention to the complex of emotions that are involved in longing and awe. In the Renaissance, the conjunctio oppositorum became an established principle of intellectual life, and such mixed, even apparently contradictory feelings came to the fore at this fruitful period, in whose secular music double entendre on death and dying were commonplace. Longing is at the heart of much of the poetry and music of the High Renaissance, particularly perhaps in England, where the lament for the loss of the old order of the Catholic Church gave rise to some of the most beautifully elegiac music of all time, particularly in the many settings of the Lamentations by Tudor composers. One even finds prefigurements of the romantic longing for what is lost with childhood in a poem such as Vaughan's The Retreat or in The Centuries of Traherne. Because of its reliance on indirect expression, metaphor, and imagery, and its tolerance of the incomplete and unresolved rather than explicitness and the resolution of contradictory propositions in the pursuit of clarity and certainty, the epistemology of the right hemisphere is congenial to ambiguity and the union of opposites, and therefore to longing, where that of the emotionally circumscribed left hemisphere cannot afford to be. I would suggest that longing, not necessarily in the form of Die blaue Blume of the Romantics, it is interesting that it originates in Novalis and signifies a union with nature, is a concept surely as ancient as mankind. The poetry of every culture has much to tell us about longing and belonging. In fact, belonging comes from the same old English word, langian, which forms the root of longing. It means a sense of powerful emotional attachment to my place where I am at home, and implies a sense of permanence. One finding that struck me forcibly was that some mammals bond as much with their nest as they do with their mothers. Home is not just the focus of belonging, but a typical target of longing, sometimes conflated with death, as in Eichendorff's poem Aus der Heimat hinter den Blitzen rot, beautifully set to music by Schumann, which in its painful ambiguity demonstrates how bittersweet longing is. Apparently, Heimweh, literally grief for home, was traditionally such a problem in the Swiss army that in the 18th and 19th centuries, soldiers were court-martialed if found to be singing Kuhreihen, otherwise known as Rons des Vaches, the alpine melodies used to call cattle across the valleys, since singing of these melodies apparently led not infrequently to desertion, sickness, and suicide. Or the place longed for may be a place that is of mythical power, like the Garden of Eden, as the warm south became to the northern imagination. Kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blühen? Poem of Goethe's. Do you know the land where the lemon trees flower? Even nostalgia, a rather special kind of longing, is not, despite the noble contribution of the Swiss in this regard, a culture-bound syndrome, as we're sometimes led to believe. Although the term was coined only in the late 17th century by an Alsatian medical student, Johannes Hofer, nostalgia was not invented then. In Plato's Symposium, it is, of course, the basis of the fable that the character Aristophanes tells of the origins of love, of the divided creature that longs to be reunited with its other half, a reunion or recognition of opposites that form together a living whole. It is present in Greek verse, beginning with Odysseus' longing, the original nostalgia, nostos meaning the return home, and algos, pain, for his native Ithaca. It's in the Hebrew Psalms, like as the heart desireth the water brooks, so longeth my soul after thee, O God. It is in the Anglo-Saxon poems, the wanderer and the seafarer, both as a longing for one's home when journeying, and a longing for the sea when the spring comes to the land dwellers. And it's no exaggeration to say that the Renaissance starts with the deepest of longing, that of courtly love, the awestruck worship of the unattainable ideal of womanhood, and the longing of the lover for the beloved, and progresses by Arcadian imagery and pastoral in a searching out of the past that was also a searching for a lost golden age. Nor, as this might make it sound, is it a Western phenomenon only. It is the core emotion of Oriental poetry. Nostalgia for the past is a key to the understanding of Japanese poetry, writes the celebrated Orientalist Donald Keene. For over 1,000 years, almost all short poems in Japanese consisted of evocation of the seasons, either directly or as revealed by characteristic phenomena such as mist, haze, fog, and so on. The moon, unless qualified by another seasonal word, was always the moon in autumn. Japanese poets have been unusually sensitive to the changes that accompany the seasons. Summer and winter poems were accorded only half the space given to spring and autumn poems. One could compare English romantic poets there. The mood is more often bittersweet than either tragic or joyous. Rarely is there a suggestion of the happiness of love. The poets wrote most often about the unresponsiveness of the beloved, the failure of the beloved to pay a promised visit, even the acceptance of death as the only resolution of an unhappy affair, as if joy were unseemly. So that was a long quote, all from Donald Keene. Many of the features of Romanticism are, in fact, potentially universals, part of the structure of the human mind and brain, not just aspects of a culture-bound syndrome. In other cultures, what we label romantic is seen as the natural viewpoint, to which the left hemisphere world of rationalistic mechanism and materialism appears as the culture-bound syndrome. Quintessentially, longing is, of course, for the loved one, as in so many of Heine's poems, in Wunderschönen Monat Mai, da habe ich ihr gestanden, mein Sehnen und Verlangen, my desire and longing. Or, for example, in Goethe's Nur wer die Sehnsucht kennt, weiß, was ich leide. Only he who knows what Sehnsucht is understands what I suffer. Or shades of the early Renaissance, this is in Goethe, for the eternal ideal of womanhood, das ewig Weibliche, as Goethe described it, which zieht uns hinan, which means draws us on and upwards, except that it has an added meaning. In German, the idea of anziehen includes the idea of drawing something home, as we say. And, of course, there is an ancient tradition of the soul as the bride of Christ. One finds Ramon Llull writing in the 13th century, "The beloved planted in the heart of the lover sighs and longings, virtue and love. The lover desired to attain to the farthest goal of his love for the beloved, and other objects blocked his path. For this cause, his longing, desires, and thoughts gave the lover sorrow and grief. That's the 13th century. And here we come to longing's essence. Not so much for a someone or a someplace, but for a something that has no name. It is a movement of faith in a state of uncertainty. As Shelley put it, the devotion to something afar from the sphere of our sorrow. My mind feels as if it ached to behold and know something great, wrote Coleridge, something one and indivisible, and it's only in the faith of this that rocks or waterfalls, mountains or caverns give me the sense of sublimity or majesty. But in this faith, all things counterfeit infinity. A few days later, he emphasized once again, this is from his notebooks, that this ache, this longing, involved a love of the great and the whole. Those who've been led to the same truth step by step through the constant testimony of their senses seem to me to want a sense which I possess. They contemplate nothing but parts, and all parts are necessarily little, and the universe to them is but a mass of little things. Here we see the suggestion of two ways of seeing the world, one partwise and lacking in the sense of the sublime, and the other perceiving things as a whole, which gives us insight into the awe-inspiring interconnectedness of the cosmos. The longing for God, which is both augmented and yet partially fulfilled by the sense of the sublime, is marked by the most complex of all emotions, that by which I mean the sense of the sublime is marked by the most complex of all emotions, in its revelation, which is also a revelation of hiddenness, in its overwhelming power that also invites the human spirit not to be crushed by, but exalted by, its overwhelming nature. It is as deep and as deeply paradoxical as any human experience can be, containing longing and its fulfillment at once. What Rudolf Otto famously called the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. I'd like to conclude with some very rudimentary reflections on the important question of teleology. If we're not pushed blindly, but attracted by the vision of ideals, archetypes, or, to come over all Platonic, the form of the beautiful, teleology enters the picture once more. The philosopher of biology, David Hull, noted that J.B.S. Haldane in the 1930s can be found remarking, teleology is like a mistress to a biologist. He cannot live without her, but he's unwilling to be seen with her in public. Today, the mistress has become a lawfully wedded wife, says Hull. Biologists no longer feel obligated, apparently that's what people say in some parts of the world, feel obligated to apologize for their use of teleological language. They flaunt it. The only concession which they make to its disreputable past is to rename it teleonomy. Well, it depends which biologist you're lucky enough to be around. Here, I'd like to quote, if I may, John Cottingham in an interview with David McPherson. Many scientists talk teleologically. It's curious, actually, that many people discussing the modern scientific worldview use words like random and accidental. We're just an accidental blip on the face of the cosmos. But that can't be quite right. It does seem that it's quite natural for galaxies to form. It's natural for some stars to explode into supernovas and to produce heavier elements. It's natural for planets to form. And most scientists say that sooner or later, given the right conditions, life will emerge. And then, given the Darwinian principles of selection, intelligence is likely to be favored. So the scientific conclusion from all that seems to be that the universe is, as the British astronomer Royal Martin Rees puts it, both biophilic and noophilic, that is to say, it will tend in due course to produce life and intelligence. There is a natural tendency there, if you like, So using words like accident, random, and so on is in a way misleading. Those were John's words. As Whitehead commented, scientists animated by the purpose of proving that they're purposeless constitute an interesting subject for study. Perhaps, though, one might point out not as curious as the highly animated consciousness of some philosophers aiming to prove that consciousness does not exist. The tendency to think in teleological terms is found experimentally to be as strong in scientists as in anyone else, which is in any case obvious from the fact, as John Cottingham notes, that they find themselves incapable of talking about any natural process without invoking teleology in the language used, the locus classic of this being the selfish gene. A phrase which, to do justice to Richard Dawkins, he apparently now rather regrets. The sense that we live in a purposeless universe, an artifact of the official scientific method from which considerations of teleology are de facto excluded, spills over and infects the human condition. This discovery of the purposelessness of nature and of the universe by prominent scientists reminds me of C.S. Lewis's observation in A Preface to Paradise Lost on another matter, that it is as if a policeman who, having himself stopped all the traffic in a certain street, should then solemnly write down in his notebook, "The stillness in this street is highly suspicious." The idea that humans might have purposes is nonetheless not hugely controversial, but the message is we make up our own to keep ourselves happily deluded enough not to become frankly mad. At the level of getting Marmite from Sainsbury's, we obviously do have purposes, but what about the overarching purposes of a life? Do we just imagine that there are things towards which we should strive? Well, imagination is not just about fiction, but, as Richard Feynman pointed out, about understanding the situation into which we are thrown. And I would say it is the process whereby we create the reality we experience, which is never given to us completed, cold, and inert. Longing is perhaps an expression of the deep emotional, intellectual, and spiritual connection we experience in relation to aspects of a transcendent reality which itself needs us in order to be fulfilled as much as we need it in order to be fulfilled ourselves. As Meister Eckhart says, God needs the human soul as much as the human soul needs God. At a minimum, supposedly non-teleological explanations of life take for granted and do nothing to explain the desire or tendency of living things to stay alive and their endeavour to reproduce. Whitehead was once again on the money when he pointed out that life itself is comparatively deficient in survival value. The art of persistence is to be dead. Aristotle, who famously maintained that nature acts for an end, thought he had come across the truth of nature from the moment when he perceived its beauty. Not so much aesthetic beauty, such as that of light and colour or form, says Etienne Gilson, but first of all, and above all, the intelligible beauty which consists in the apperception by the mind of the order which rules the structure of the forms and presides over their relations. This reminds me of the mathematicians and physicists who commented that they were led to see the aspects of reality they were able to reveal by first seeing their beauty. And this is actually not far from Darwin, who in The Origin of Species twice noted in the same words that we see beautiful and curious adaptations everywhere in the organic world, and in speaking of the Orchis pyramidalis and the adaptation of its parts, repeats, "I never saw anything so beautiful. The beauty of the adaptation of parts seems to me unparalleled." So what did he think of teleology? When Asa Gray, the most important American botanist of the 19th century, reviewed Darwin's legacy for Nature in June 1874, yes, Nature was publishing away in 1874, he wrote, We recognize the great service rendered by Darwin to natural science by restoring teleology to it, so that instead of having morphology against teleology, we shall have henceforth morphology married to teleology. Darwin wrote to him in reply, "What you say about teleology pleases me especially, and I do not think anyone else has ever noticed the point. I've always said you are the man to hit the nail on the head." Even Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, wrote that, quote, "Perhaps the most remarkable service to the philosophy of biology rendered by Mr. Darwin is the reconciliation of teleology and morphology, and the explanation of the facts of both, which his view offers." Less than a year before he died, Darwin seemed to deny a purpose in the universe, but in the same breath affirmed what he called his, quote, "inward conviction that the universe is not the result of chance." What I suspect is that he did not, why should he, like the ghastly idea of a universe that was as deterministic as Paley's, but recognized at the same time that chance alone won't do. Even God, in my view, and here as so often I'm with Bergson, did not predetermine nature, though the universe is instinct with a sense of purpose, order, and intelligence which speaks of a divine order. Part of the confusion about what evolution implies and does not imply comes, I think, from whether we see the world left hemisphere fashion or right hemisphere fashion. As Gilson notes, nature works not like the human worker assembling parts, but by producing totalities whose existence implies the existence of what we call their parts. She does not build up plants or animals out of organs. She makes organs in the process of producing animals and plants. So to escape that left hemisphere view, we need, as Bergson did, to see creation as dealing in whole evolving forms, not progressing by one tiny adaptation in isolation at a time. It's now widely accepted that evolution cannot work on chance alone, but that there are tendencies towards certain forms which hugely accelerate the process. This would be in keeping with Cambridge paleontologist Simon Conway Morris's concept of convergence, whereby something like the eye has been invented 8 times during the course of evolutionary history separately. And just think how complicated it is to invent it once. More than this, Gilson has pointed out that normally mechanism excludes finalism, the belief in a final cause or an end or telos. But finalism does not exclude mechanism. On the contrary, it necessarily implicates it. Here is a good example of how a broad view that is inclusive makes more sense than a narrow one that is exclusive. And in brief, one could say that the right hemisphere is the hemisphere of both and, the left hemisphere that of either or. Denying that anything but a human being has a purpose leads to scientists feeling they can't say a bird gathers twigs to build a nest, but have to say a bird gathers twigs and builds a nest, as though there was nothing more than a grammatical copula to keep nature's processes going. Such PC language is annoying, but it has a more sinister purpose, which is to encourage the idea that, like consciousness, life is nothing special and is mechanical in nature. After all, as scientists used to know, animals can't feel pain. I'm rigorously steering clear of fingering Descartes for this one, since I know better than to do so in John's presence, and you've well defended him against that charge. And babies don't feel pain. Outrageous caricature, you say. How could anyone believe that? Well, it may surprise some of my audience to learn that until the 1970s, babies were regularly operated on without an anesthetic because in those days they couldn't feel pain and anesthetizing them posed a risk. And of course they were not going to sue afterwards. And I was one of those babies. Though there may be, as David Hull suggests, a softening of the line that the natural world is devoid of consciousness or purpose, what about the universe more generally? Not just what we call the living world. There is here a problem similar to that of the existence of consciousness and intelligence. how they arose in an unconscious, unintelligent universe is hard, perhaps impossible to explain without one of those hand-waving and here a miracle happens moments in the middle of the equations. I found a congruence with my own ideas earlier in this lecture when I came across this passage of Arthur Koestler's The Sleepwalkers, the whole thesis of which is, after all, that we need to marry rationalism with intuition, and that it is this marriage that gives birth to real scientific advance. Today we know that on the subatomic level, the fate of an electron or a whole atom is not determined by its past. But this discovery has not led to any basically new departure in the philosophy of nature, only to a state of bewildered embarrassment, a further retreat of physics into a language of even more abstract symbolism. Yet, if causality has broken down and events are not rigidly governed by the pushes and pressures of the past, may they not be influenced in some manner by the pull of the future, which is a manner of saying that purpose may be a concrete physical factor in the evolution of the universe, both on the organic and inorganic levels. In the relativistic cosmos, gravitation is a result of the curvature and creases in space which continually tend to straighten themselves out, which, as the mathematician Sir Edmund Whittaker remarked, is a statement so completely teleological that it certainly would have delighted the hearts of the schoolmen. We find ourselves, it seems to me, thrown, as Heidegger would say, or perhaps better projected, into a conscious universe that is not wholly determined by the past, whether by genes or by God, but formed by the longing that leads us onward to certain truths by their beauty. Of course, I have Keats on my side, but I also have that dry old stick Bertrand Russell. Let me try to draw together the threads of these ruminations. I'm sorry, I've covered a lot of ground, so I'm hoping this will be clearer. The hemispheres generate two understandings of purpose, one that is limiting and one that is liberating. This is not surprising because, as I constantly have to emphasize, hemisphere difference is not a matter of doing different things, but doing the same things differently. One is a local short-term purpose of the kind to be found in Cars's finite games. This is the lust for Marmite. It is a want, it is directed, its target is precise, and it achieves its goal. Unfortunately, I will not say science, but the modern science establishment is engaged in degrading things like music, dance, laughter, play, and ultimately love and religion as in the service, I should say, of such specifiable goals. While our sense of them is that they are gloriously without purpose, or rather, they find their purpose in themselves. They are infinite games played for the sake of the playing, which might be a good description of life itself, provided we do not think of play as trivial or competitive, but as liberating from the tyranny of self and acquisition. The other kind of purpose is deep, long, broad, overarching, indistinctly discerned, strongly intuited, unless we've become habituated to disattending to our intuitions. In other words, it bears all the hallmarks of its right hemisphere origins. This is the purpose that is currently being denied. I will not say by science, and that is why I cited Darwin at some length, but by the modern science establishment. It's busy affirming one purpose where there is none and denying one where there is one. This has its correlate with a couple of other hemisphere distinguished pairs. One is curiosity versus wonder, and the other is longing and wanting. There was no time to explore curiosity and wonder today, but I might just say that there again, curiosity risks becoming presumptuous, acquisitive of information and knowledge, narrow-focused and objectifying of its target, which it aims to know fully. Finite game concluded. There is no room for awe here, since the aim is to replace the sense of inadequate understanding by certain knowledge. Wonder opens up in a humble spirit to the astonishment of being, seeing enough of the picture to understand what it is that it does not and cannot know. Infinite game to be continued. As Plato and Aristotle and Goethe and even Descartes made clear, philosophy begins in wonder, and according to the ever-wise Goethe, finds itself ending there. Science, I fear, as Chargaff feared, is increasingly tempted to remain limited by curiosity, not knowing what it is it doesn't know. And longing and wanting are, of course, the other faux amis, the ones I've taken for my subject. The structure is similar, so I won't labour the point. The process of longing is not clear-willed, superficial, but tentative, intuitive, and deep. It's like many a process in life, one that declares, or rather confides, its aim only in the following of it, an infinite aim. It is a still small voice, but one that calls more loudly as one follows it, even though what it has to say brings one more and more clearly to an understanding of how little one understands, which is not at all the same as ignorance. Indeed, the only way not to be limited by the left hemisphere's certainties is to entrain its valuable contributions in the service of the right hemisphere. We must not forsake what Chargaff calls the fertile night for the lumber room illuminated by the flashlight of our meagre intellect. Thank you.